Okay, so picture this. After a pretty chaotic arrival in the afterlife, a young woman named Abby makes a really startling choice. Instead of trying to argue her way into heaven, she actually volunteers for something called remedial soul school. So, let's take a look at what her orientation is all about.
This is the one question that her orientation forces her to confront right off the bat. It completely reframes the whole spiritual journey, not as some passive reward you get, but as an active process of learning and, well, growing. It's a massive shift in perspective, and her first lesson starts by looking at her life, not through her actions, but through her energy.
So her first lesson isn't a lecture or some pop quiz. It's a life review, but with a pretty big twist. The school's registrar, the one running the show, isn't interested in just tallying up good deeds versus bad deeds. Nope. Instead, the focus is on something way more fundamental. How Abby used, or more often, withheld her spiritual energy, what they call her mystic light.
And here, we see this key memory play out. Abby's just 14, she's lying in bed. A friend texts her, clearly panicking and really needing to talk. Abby sees the message, and she feels that little flicker of connection. That's the spiritual energy. But she chooses her own comfort over that connection. She just sends a quick, "We'll pray for you" text and goes right back to scrolling on her phone. The energy that could have flowed outward to her friend was instead just turned right back inward.
And this right here gets to the registrar's main point. The problem isn't one single sin or bad choice. It's the habit. It's this deeply ingrained pattern of rerouting that spiritual energy away from other people and just pointing it toward her own convenience. A tiny little choice, but one that was repeated thousands and thousands of times, and that's what ultimately shaped her entire spiritual life.
All right, the second lesson in her diagnosis, this one gets even more personal. It takes a hard look at how Abby treated her own physical body, not as something she owned, but as a temporary, rented vehicle that she was actually responsible for maintaining. And this was Abby's core justification for her whole lifestyle. Junk food, not enough sleep, binging horror movies late at night. She basically treated her body like it was disposable. Why? Because she believed it was just a temporary problem that some higher power would eventually fix for her. She saw it as something to be endured, not cared for, all because she assumed a perfect replacement was just waiting for her in the afterlife.
And this really reveals a key confusion she had. Abby mistook spiritual intensity for spiritual consistency. She was always chasing these big emotional highs at worship events, but completely neglecting the small, consistent acts of self-care, like, just getting enough sleep or managing her stress. The lesson here is that real spirituality isn't built in these dramatic public displays. It's built in the quiet, repeated, private practice.
So this brings us to the final part of Abby's orientation, which looks at the huge difference between belief and practice. This lesson explores how she used her own deeply held beliefs not as a tool for growth, but more like a shield to avoid the real, hard work of personal change. The registrar shows her this pattern over and over again. Abby would have these incredibly powerful emotional experiences at church services, tears streaming down her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. But that intense energy, it just had nowhere to go. It wasn't channeled into action or into serving others or into any kind of personal change. It just dissipated, leaving her right back where she started, just waiting for the next spiritual high.
As the registrar explains it, Abby's belief became this static declaration, like a framed seed on a wall. It was something to be admired, something to point to, but it was never actually planted in the soil of her life or watered with any kind of practice. And because of that, it never, ever grew.
So after this brutally honest diagnosis of her spiritual habits, Abby isn't given a punishment. She's not condemned or shamed or anything like that. Instead, she's given her very first assignment, a concrete, actionable step that's designed to start rewiring her entire orientation to life.
Her assignment is to change her fundamental question. That's it. Instead of operating from this place of entitlement, implicitly asking, okay, when do I get my reward? When do I get what I deserve? She now has to shift to a question of responsibility. What, right here and now, can I repair?
The process is deceptively simple. First, she just has to notice when her old patterns kick in. The victimhood, the entitlement, that passive waiting for someone else to fix things. Then, once she notices it, she has to consciously redirect her energy away from that old script and towards some small act of repair. The goal isn't to be perfect. It's all about the practice of just being aware.
So the ultimate takeaway from Abby's entire orientation is that this school isn't about paying for past sins. It's a training ground.
It's all about fundamentally changing her internal circuitry, moving from a passive faith that's based on getting some external reward to an active practice focused on internal transformation.
And that really is the core lesson here, isn't it? This fundamental shift from entitlement to responsibility, from just waiting around to actually acting. Abby's first assignment is to ask, what can I repair? So I'll just leave you with that same question. If you were given that assignment right now, what would be the very first thing you'd choose to repair?